We talked about this boasts an eclectic rotating panel of hosts who join me each episode. And these guests range in with different genders, ages, backgrounds, and countries. But one thing they have in common is that they're friends of the show. Joining me today, both from Tokyo, is Justin. Say hello, Justin.
Hello, Justin.
This is Justin's, third appearance on the show?
I believe so.
And also joining from Tokyo is Sileem. Sileem, loyal listener, self-proclaimed fan of the show, returns for the second time.
Yes,
Welcome
indeed.
back, Sileem. Happy
to be back on the podcast.
Now, I don't want this show to be about politics. I've always tried to avoid that, but it tends to take us down a rabbit trail of despair, I'll call it, especially recent American politics. But I do want to just quickly ask you, did you watch the inauguration of Joe Biden? And if there's a general feeling yet in Japan how this new president will affect things in your country?
Personally, I watched a little bit of the highlights. Obviously, we couldn't really avoid catching a lot of the memes and things that came off of it, specifically around people like Bernie Sanders and what he wore to the inauguration, and not just him, several others. It appeared that fashion was definitely on the top of a lot of people's minds in a lot of the highlights that I saw, which is great. That means that we're not focused on the absolute burning bag of dog turd that it seemed like previous events have captivated attention in a very different way. So the only thing I could say from a local standpoint, I did see some of the conservative papers here immediately pivoting to Joe Biden's age and anxiety about his health and age, which I found kind of comical, considering if you look at most of the DA, he would probably be in the middle in terms of age of some of the...
What's DA? Sorry.
The Japanese parliament.
Oh, the diet or diet? Or
DA. I don't know.
Yeah,
please.
Oh, I'm sure you're pronouncing it right. But it looks like diet. Yeah. And I remember when I was in Japan, I saw the Diet Building or something, and I thought, would they dedicate an entire building to like health and fitness?
I think it's diet. I mean, yeah,
it probably is diet.
Because you also have, when they talk about a government, they might say like, the Biden regime, right? And regime is another word for diet as well. Diet being, losing weight diet. So I don't know why. That is, but yeah.
Interesting. Okay. How about you, Sileem? What's your take on it from where you sit?
I wasn't able to watch it live. It was I was playing at 2 a.m. Japanese Standard Time, so it was pretty late at night. But I did catch the highlights the next day, and I was actually eager to see the highlights, see what was going on. The inauguration is always a big event, right, in the political calendar, and personally, I'm also a bit relieved that things have finally calmed down in the U.S. The previous administration was just, it was just all, a lot, right? There was just always a lot going on, and I feel like with this new Biden administration, things will go back to a bit of normality, which is nice. I think a lot of people will be sighing a breath of relief.
Yeah, I think that was the emotion I had when I was watching it. For us, it was, I think, around 11:30 in the morning, and I just had it on the side as I was working, and that was what I felt, was just relief from all the noise and all the BS that has been going on with it, and just bringing some class back to the office of the president, to me, I think is hopefully the best thing that comes from this is, and I said to a friend the other day that with a certain amount of coaching and advice for Trump, which of course I'm sure received lots of probably early on and ignored all of it. I think if he had followed some of that, I think he would have probably been reelected. But then again, maybe not. Maybe the base that he has would have not followed him as closely if he was different, if he was more of a kind of classy guy in that position. So It's so hard to
Absolutely,
say.
yeah. I mean, considering that he still got, I think, like 74 million votes, that's significant.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
I think it's more than any other Republican president in history or Republican candidate in history. So, you know, that's a feat in and of itself. And, you know, maybe a lot of people say in the news media that if COVID hadn't happened, he would have had a pretty good chance of being reelected. So, you know, the outcome is the outcome.
Yeah.
But in any case, I'm just happy it's all done and over with.
Agreed. Well, moving on from that, we have our first topic. So what do you do? It's a classic question most people ask or get asked when they meet someone for the first time. And is it a trite expression? Is it too personal? Why do we ask it? And what are we hoping to gain by asking it? Is it just because we have nothing more original to ask? Sileem, you brought this topic to the table. What made you choose this for discussion today?
Yeah, so I mean, I was thinking about obviously things to talk about on the podcast today, and one of the things that came up was a question that I was actually asked recently when I was meeting someone new, and that was, you know, what do you do for a living? And you know, I answered the question, of course, and it's perfectly fine. It wasn't in the context of work, right? So it wasn't the person I was meeting for work or business, and then I just thought, you know, if you're meeting someone for the first time and you want to get to know them, is asking what they do for a living a good question, right? I mean, what does what you do for a living say about you as a person? And arguably it could say a lot, right? I mean, there are people who whose work is their passion, right? And I work in the insurance industry. I'm not saying that insurance is not my passion, but
Are you saying it is your passion?
Yeah, I am passionate about what I do.
Good.
But you know, if you were, I don't know, if you were an artist or a musician, I imagine that's definitely something that you're passionate about and you do for a living as well. A
pilot.
Yeah. So, you know, I was just thinking, in I think many cases, what I do doesn't really say anything about me, or maybe it does. We also do spend a third of our waking adult life in our jobs, right? So it's obviously a lot of time spent working. So, you know, it's a relevant question, but
that's a good point. Yeah, what we do is, what we're doing for, as you said, a significant time. Waking hours are spent doing something.
Yeah.
So when you ask someone what do they do, I guess it's a pretty relevant question. But to me, the question is just so completely unoriginal and boring.
Yeah, exactly.
And where I first came across this criticism of this question was when I was single and I was reading like books, dating advice material. And one of the things they said in this one particular person that was giving advice was, do not ask that question when you meet someone for the first time if you're hoping to have a romantic result. That there's nothing more boring than the typical question that is usually the first or second question that you ask someone. So, what do you do? It's just such an unoriginal, boring question, followed by, so tell me about your family. Where are you from? Kind of falls into that same category.
Yeah.
So that's where I first saw it was in, if you're going to meet someone, especially a female that you're hoping to have a romantic relationship with, what do you do is one of the most unromantic or unoriginal things you can possibly bring to the table when you first meet someone.
Yeah.
Well, you're basically expecting them to do all the heavy lifting in the conversation by asking a question like that, right? If you're not actually actively engaging them and saying, what brings you here tonight? Or how do you know such and such? Or, you know, why did you move to this city? Why did you choose here? If you're not actually engaging them at who they are at a base level, you're not going to get anywhere with them anyways. So,
yeah, exactly. I mean, the conversation really won't I mean, it could obviously, if the person is a really engaging person, they can try to ask a little bit more about your career, but often it's a pretty dead end question. Of course, it does depend, but what are better questions I want to ask you guys? What are better questions to ask someone for the first time when you want to get to know them?
That's good. That's a good one. I think one of my rules is to just not start with that question. So once I slide that out of the way and keep it in the back of my mind and it's not like it's not going to come up. I figure it could come up, and when it does come up, it just is going to come up. I just try to ask anything but that, and so it just seems to come out. I just talk about maybe if it's sports and there's something on the TV. Some people might roll their eyes and say, "Oh God, well that's what's so original about that?" But
yeah,
I just try to have a conversation with somebody without starting with that question. And I feel, because here's something that came to mind when you brought this up. I worked with a guy whose wife was a exotic dancer. And
okay,
this was 15 years ago. I was working for an insurance company, and I was a bit more conservative even than I am today in a lot of ways. And I was always paranoid that when we were out together, either with colleagues or externally, that who we were with were going to ask the question, like, what do you do? And then you get into, if his wife came up, it's like, oh, so what does your wife do? I was always so afraid of that topic coming up and him answering that in front of clients or in front of colleagues, because I just didn't know how they were going to react to it. And I don't know, call me shallow, but that was something that was always a concern for me, was if he had to bring that up. And I'll tell you a quick story. So him and my boss, this would have been his boss too, like his boss, his boss's boss, they drove on a car ride to a social event that we did an offsite at this resort. And it so happened they lived fairly close to each other. So he took a ride up to this resort with my boss's boss. Yeah. And I thought, in the hour and 40 minutes that this car ride is gonna take, how that question won't come up.
Oh yeah, it's bound to.
And I remember, I think I just asked him, so how did it go? And so what'd you guys talk about? He said, oh yeah, we talked about pretty much everything. And I think somehow he mentioned that he talked about his wife. And I said, so what did you say she did? And he said, I told him she was a photographer. Which actually was not incorrect. She did do photography. So in my mind, I was always like, can you just say that when you answer the question?
I guess nowadays it would be an OnlyFans account, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you do? Yeah. To me, it's just such an unoriginal question. And yeah, there is a difference. Like if you're a pilot, or you're a race car driver, or an actor, that question at a party just has a much different impact. But I wonder if people who are those things also hate that question.
Because I imagine, I mean, they have to, once they do answer it, the reaction is maybe fairly typical, amongst all the people who ask the question. It's like, oh, you're a pilot. Oh, that's cool. You get to travel all around the world. Wow. At the same time, I really don't like being asked that question, because there aren't a lot of people out there who are passionate about insurance, and often the conversation just gets, my answer just gets a bit of a blank stare. Oh, insurance.
Yeah.
End of conversation. But
well, the advice I got early in my career was, when you're at a party, never say you're in insurance, because it will immediately gravitate to, well, I have 2 cars and a house, and I know that I'm paying more than my neighbor, and I don't understand why. Can you help me with that?
Yeah.
Right. They want the instant quote.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or
done
you
that a
get
few
the
times.
other, or you get the other piece, which is, oh, you guys, I had a claim last year where my auto insurance company refused to pay for this, and you guys are a bunch of scammers. You make all kinds of money, and they're big, tall buildings with your fountains outside. You guys are just like screwing everybody. That's the other direction it can often take.
Yeah. I mean,
Except when you need me.
exactly, except when you need me. Justin, what do you think? I mean, what's a good intro question?
I think a lot of people kind of defer to a version of the "you come here often" type of question, which is essentially the
Okay, that's the granddaddy.
right. But that's what people go to. They go to a variation of that, right? They go to, oh, do you come to these gallery things all the time? Or, oh, do you come to dinner parties with such and such all the time? So it's like a variation of the "you come here often." But to your question, I guess it really depends on who I'm engaging with and why I'm there. Am I there to socialize? Am I there because I'm amongst friends? Am I there because I'm seeking a potential date? As Clark was mentioning before. In all cases, I try to lead with empathy. So I try to engage with the person in what they're appearing to be engaged with. Are they engaged with the event itself? Are they engaged with people that are putting on the event? Are they engaged, or are they completely disengaged? That's something that's easy to engage with as well. It's
I like
this
that.
is just an absolute mess, isn't it? That type of thing. And you can poke fun at it and just have fun with that for a couple minutes. That's dangerous though too, because if the person's overly negative, now you've just been sucked into something. But
Or if they're the event
I mean,
organizer.
yeah,
You look
sure,
pretty bored.
Sure. That's a
You're
good
at a house
early
party
exit.
and you
Yep.
accidentally tell the host this party sucks.
What about the Japanese? Is this a question the Japanese ask each other in their culture? Is this a question that is part of the Japanese culture?
All the time.
Yeah.
I get it all the time. Justin, what about you? Do you get it fairly often?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'd say with Japanese friends and colleagues, it's probably even more so because it's a more comfortable entryway
Oh yeah.
into a discussion.
It's an easy
At
question
least
to ask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, all the time. I think I kind of alluded to this before we jumped on to the call and the podcast itself, that, depending on where you live, those questions are very loaded questions. The questions can be about, where you live, what kind of living you're making for yourself, how successful you are, how eligible you are for someone else, or whether you're worth their time in some cases. So
And you're saying that about
I find those
Japanese in general or just in general?
just in general. I mean, and kind of more major markets, right? Major metropolises. There can be that much more aggressive tone to that question, where it's very purposeful.
So what do you do?
Yeah. Are you worth my time?
Yeah.
Or should I be bothering to engage with you? And vice versa. Like, okay, so long. That's the limit. We're leading with this, and there's very purposeful around why you're leading with this. I have no interest in engaging with you beyond this. Where's the bar?
I mean, there's a lot of importance put on status in Japan as well, right? So I think it's one of the reasons why it's all the more common, to ask that question and be asked that question in Japan, because status is quite important, right? And it's not just limited to yourself, right? I mean, I've gotten asked what my wife does plenty of times as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not an exotic dancer, though.
No, she's not an exotic dancer, no. Unfortunately, or fortunately.
All right. So what about a product or a service you're currently using? We take a bit of time each segment, usually, or each show to talk about a product or a service. And for one, am enjoying the use of Polygon resistance bands. These are resistance bands for working out. I'd been looking for adjustable dumbbells for quite some time, and they're super expensive. I don't know if you've ever looked into it, but I was looking at a pair of Bowflex dumbbells, like $800, like crazy.
What?
I
That's
just
insane.
thought they were simple looking, and I didn't want something that took up a lot of space. And Justin's nodding his head. No way on the Bowflex adjustable dumbbells. So I got these resistance bands at the advice of a friend, and I love them. Like these, they take up no space. You have them in little bags. I've got a couple different types, and I've been using them. I've used them while I'm working, like doing a meeting. I was listening to a meeting the other day, and I'm doing these like stretches. I wasn't on camera, of course, but I had it rigged up here. I was doing them, just listening to the meeting, and thought, wow, this is perfect. So Polygon resistance bands. I'll put a note in the show notes. How about you guys?
Justin, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. From a product standpoint, something that I've been using more frequently, not just recently, but just the last few years, has been Twitter. Twitter is my go-to. It is my search engine. It is my collection of journalists and a certain amount of my network here in Japan as well. It's been something that I cultivated and put some attention to a few years back. And the people on there have been tremendously resourceful in terms of everything from getting someone to come in and fix something like a tradesperson to a doctor, a dentist, something for my kids.
Really? So
something to deal with schooling, anything in between. And it helps because, I have this group of maybe 200 to 300 people that are always really tied into things around Tokyo and Japan in general. And they can spit back information or send me to other people that are really, really helpful. And it cuts down all the research time and everything else and getting actual reviews, in essence, from people. They have no problem in being very clear. One person says, well, what about this doctor? And 3 other people say, oh, no, terrible experience there with this, and this. And in other cases, it's 4 or 5 people chiming in and saying, no, actually, you should talk to this teacher or talk to this specialist if you have this need for your child or for something else. And it's been a great resource, professionally, personally. I can say that Twitter can be an absolute cesspool, but it also can be extremely entertaining and extremely helpful, especially if you're somebody who's living in a market that's not necessarily your native market. And there are people who are very open to helping each other because it can be isolating for everybody. So I think with that in mind, it's been great for me and a lot of the people that are part of that kind of few hundred people that always are exchanging with each other.
That's really incredible. I mean, I've never actually heard of anyone using Twitter like that.
No. Are these private messages, or are they public forum? Like anybody can see this dialogue that goes back and forth?
It's pretty public. I mean, on some occasions, there's topic or, something that would be easier to share on privately. Like let's say one of the people in this general network is asking a question about needing a lawyer for something. You may want to take that privately. If there's something around investments or otherwise that someone is kind of starting to kind of play with and seek more advice on, then that may go private as well, because the person may be sharing reports or information to help them kind of think those things through. So, you don't have the full conversation in public, but a lot of times it's a fair amount of the input coming back and forth. And sometimes you're getting 20 to 30 responses from these different people. It's very, very helpful.
And these are all people you know?
Like some of them I've met in real life. Some of them I actually have met in real life over the last, say, 3 to 5 years. I would say I count on 3 or 4 of them to be good friends. Some of which actually found out lived not far away, and others lived much farther away, or have left Japan and returned. Yeah, it's a pretty wide variety of people, wide variety of ages, cultures, backgrounds, sex, gender.
How about you, Sileem?
Some of them have actually ended up marrying each other.
That's amazing. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I've got a podcast that I wanted to quickly talk about. Now, caveat though, I haven't listened to the whole thing. It's like a series. And I haven't listened to the whole thing, so I can't give a final report on it. Mm-hmm. But it's called The Rabbit Hole, and it's from the New York Times. It's a 10-part series, maybe 8, and it talks about the internet, to put it in one word, and more specifically, social media, and talks about YouTube in a bit of detail as well, and how YouTube and kind of social media began, and how an element of it is has been quite sinister, almost, in the sense of how the algorithm behind YouTube, for instance, made it that if someone was watching something, the suggested videos would be of a similar nature, right? So therefore, reinforcing someone's, let's say, if it's talking about politics, for instance, reinforcing someone's existing views about something, and maybe even pushing someone towards the extreme. Now, like I said, I haven't finished the whole thing, so I can't really talk about this in too much detail. But it's really interesting, and every episode is about 30 minutes. I think it's 8 in total, and I'd recommend anyone to take a listen if and when you've got the time to do so.
Okay, boys and their toys. Are boys naturally drawn to guns, cars, and camouflage and manly things? How much influence do parents, peers, and general culture have on this? We, at least in North American culture, we dress our baby boys in blue, our baby girls in pink. We paint the baby room in the same colors. Justin, this was your topic. Tell us why you wanted to talk about this today.
I guess this kind of came from a bit of a nature versus nurture type of conversation. There are elements of this that I've observed in my own children and in other children that have always intrigued me. I've always taken it very clearly that whenever I experience media, or even shopping for that matter, that there's certain imagery and there's also certain ways in which that we present products that are a little bit specific to gender. If you walk into a Target or a Walmart and you go into the clothing section and you go into the boys section, it's all Marvel characters and superheroes and military related imagery. And when you go to the girls' side, it's all pink and princesses and unicorns and everything frilly. So obviously we perpetuate this in some way, shape, or form in culture and in the way that we expect our children to dress, or at least in mass consuming ways, expect them to dress or consume things. But it made me start to kind of question how much of this is nature, how much of this is nurture, and what kind of things are boys and girls drawn to. There was a period long ago when I was a child where there was a very popular, I believe, child psychologist who wrote a book named it was by a Dr. Spock, not to be confused with Spock from Star Trek. Yeah. And part of the concept was basically allowing your children to experience both versions of what would be considered gender norm, and give your son a doll, give your daughter a Nerf gun or a play gun, and see how they have comfort, interpret it, and desire that item as something that is part of their identity. My parents tried that with me, and it didn't work. I took the doll and I threw it in the toilet. But I don't know if at that stage had I already seen enough, experienced enough that would make me inclined to do that. I don't know if that was just natural. I don't have a point of reference for that. I saw with my own older boy, by the time he could actually form sentences, he was just constantly talking about cars. He was always spotting luxury vehicles far down the road. He could see the lights. Oh, that's a Porsche. That's a Ferrari. That's a this. That's a that. And he learned those cars very quickly. He always wanted to look at those cars. He found them attractive. He found specifically high-end cars, which is dangerous, attractive. But later, he liked looking at military trucks and all these different things because he just got more and more engaged in that. Now, was that an entry point because his dad was interested in vehicles and cars? Is that because I like certain refined things, or was that naturally what he was doing? Was it an engagement point for him? So I'll leave it as a kind of a jumping off point, because I know I'm kind of diverting here specifically to the automotive side, but manly things, boy things, what we identify as being strong as a boy should be, quote unquote, I'm putting quotes up in the air. Some of those things are fairly antiquated, and those are things maybe not even a generation, but maybe 2 generations before us, where that kind of language would be used with little boys and girls. And I think we're moving away from that, but at the same time, the consumption and the imagery and everything else still reflects an old way. So I'm interested in your thoughts and your experiences and what you observe.
Well, I have 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and so I see... I often wondered about this. I remember reading an article a few years ago about a person or a couple that was going to raise their kid in a gender-neutral way. And this was probably 10 years ago, where this was not as open a topic as it is today, the whole gender and neutral and all pronouns and things that are being talked about these days. And I often wonder, so they said they were going to dress the child in just neutral clothing, not pink, not blue, and not really even discuss things like what you're saying, like putting a Nerf gun in their hand, or having a dollhouse for if it's a girl, and a G.I. Joe layout in the bedroom, toys, Marvel characters. They were just going to raise this child in a kind of a gender neutral way. And there was a lot of controversy around this, that you're going to screw up this kid's identity if they don't know what they are. I don't think they were actually saying that they wouldn't say whether the child was a boy or a girl or not, but there was a lot of controversy around how this was going to screw up this kid's life. And I remember, so I've kind of I've been looking at things like what my daughter and my son gravitate to. There is no doubt my daughter loves pink. She loves princesses. She's totally into that. And we at one point, and purposely so, never tried to steer her in a direction like that. Because going back to what you were just saying, there is some of that goes on, this steering, and whether it's by commercial, like toy makers or the advertising. But we always just tried to keep a hands-off approach to what they would be interested in. Now, hockey, my son, I definitely hoped he would take up hockey and enjoy hockey and baseball, my 2 favorite sports. And he does like those sports. But same with women and babies. Like, you see girls carrying around like dolls you mentioned. But my daughter definitely has an affinity for picking up a doll and carrying it. She picks up our cat all the time and holds it like a baby. And you can tell she's like looking forward to the day when she can be a mother. And I don't see my son do that sort of thing. And we've never pushed that at all. So I think it is both. It's nature and nurture. But I think a lot of it's nature. I think you are or you aren't. And when you hold a baby, and the way you can't just be influenced to talk to a baby like a doll, like the way she talks. I think this is just something in her nature.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely both, right? It's definitely both nature and nurture. Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I'm also, I don't have kids of my own, but I'd certainly want to raise them in a fairly neutral fashion. I mean, I don't want to steer I wouldn't want to steer my kids in one direction or the other. They should pick up whatever they feel he or she, whatever, they feel that they want to gravitate towards. And I think that's fine. Ultimately, I feel like whatever environment that they're put in will affect them in one way, shape, or form, right? I mean, I guess if it's a girl and she's a girl and mom's obviously a girl, they can relate to that, right? I mean, and human beings in their nature, they just want to relate to things that they have in common with other people, right? So if we're both girls and mom was taking care of, women were taking care of babies, then I as a girl want to take care of my own, baby doll. So I guess that, the environment molds kids in that kind of way. For me personally, I guess I don't necessarily recall my parents or grandparents, directing me either in any way. I didn't like action figures, for instance, as a thing, but I didn't necessarily like dolls either. So I mean, the whole concept of having plastic things that are shaped as humans was always pretty freaky to me to begin with. I loved machines, and I guess typical, air quotes, boy things, right? I loved cars, I loved machines, planes, ships, Lego, you name it. That's kind of what I was into, and I don't necessarily think that I was steered in that direction, but it's what I naturally just gravitated towards. And I guess there's a reason why, for instance, there aren't many women in the fields of like science and engineering, for instance, even though there's a concerted effort from a lot of governments and universities now to bring more, have a little bit more gender equilibrium in those fields. From what I understand, it's a little bit difficult, right? Because I guess often women don't necessarily, or the majority of women maybe don't necessarily gravitate towards those fields as men do. I don't know, what the science is behind that. Obviously, what I'm saying is also anecdotal. I don't have, data or statistics behind what I'm saying right now, and it's just from what I read. But I guess it's just human nature in a way, right? And one thing I definitely don't like is forcing concepts, forcing ideas, forcing anything onto anyone. People should just be able to kind of do whatever they like, in my opinion, right?
I agree.
If kids want to gravitate towards something, then so be it. Let them do so.
So I had two things. I had a story I wanted to share around this, where I was picking up my daughter, or my son. I think it was my son. I don't think my daughter was born at the time. I went to the daycare to pick him up, and there was a boy who was there, and his father was also coming to pick him up. And the boy had a purse on his shoulder, and he walked up to his dad and said, "Hey, Dad." And the father was immediately like, "What are you doing with that? Put that down. Boys don't play with purses." And I just remember being so disappointed to see that, because the kid clearly was enjoying having this purse on and was excited about it, and just to be totally like put in his place, I guess, by this father, that this isn't what boys do. They don't play with dolls. And it was just so disappointing to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it happens a lot. I think a lot of people get very scared because they don't know how to handle the situation, and whatever programming they went through when they were an adolescent kind of rears up a bit too. But
and what does that reaction
most
say
cases,
to the kid too?
Well, it's just a lot of times parents who react like that aren't really that equipped in general, because they don't lead with questions and engagement. They lead more with statements and accusations.
Yeah.
So, if they work through it, it may not be that, right? Like I've had experience with one of my sons saying like, "Oh, I really like such and such. He's my boyfriend." And going, "Oh, well, what do you mean?" "He's my friend, and he's a boy, and I'm really close to him, and I really like playing with him, and I really like hanging out with him. He's my boyfriend." I said, "Okay." And kind of working through like what it is he's actually saying, not reacting to it, not responding to it in any way that maybe I conceptualize or society conceptualizes. It's just, that's just the way he was labeling it, because he really likes this person and he's opening up to someone.
But would you clarify for him how boyfriend might be perceived if he uses that word, how that could be perceived?
Right. So when we talk through it, he starts to kind of work through, and he says, "Well, actually, he's not my boyfriend. He's a friend that's a boy. And I know that like a girlfriend, a boyfriend, or somebody that you care about." So like he gets to that point eventually, like kind of talking through it. And if he didn't, and I felt like there was a gap that needed to be filled, sure, I could. But then at the other side of it is, considering his age and everything else, I'm not overthinking.
Yeah.
It's more, it's just completely coming from a place of innocence. It's not coming from a place of having to fit in a box or having to be labeled or anything otherwise. It's just language. It's just the language that he's using in that moment. Could him using that word have an effect in a public setting and someone responding to it? Do kids bully each other because of how they misinterpret or misunderstand things? Absolutely. All of those things happen. Yeah. But I find so much of my role is just getting him to be comfortable with who he is and giving him strength in that and helping him understand how to navigate and translate the world that he's engaging in more than anything. Everything else will fall into place over time. I try not to overthink that or make him overthink that. I just try to give him the strength to be confident in who he is.
Something that one thing my wife says a lot is her disappointment in Lego as it affects girls. That
yes,
when you buy Lego sets or look for Lego sets for girls, like I just Googled it now, Lego for girls, there's a lot of pink and purple coming up here. It's Lego Friendship Bus. Half of it's pink. Barbie Dreamhouse Lego. Oh no, this is just Dreamhouse, not Lego. Lego Friends Friendship House. Lego goes to it's a cafe. Lots of pink and purple about girls serving coffee and food.
Question though. Are they labeling that as Lego for girls? Is that like the official labeling? Because
no.
I thought Lego was pretty gender neutral.
Well,
I mean, obviously, there, without saying it, I imagine it is more, it's geared towards girls. But is that the official labeling?
No, it isn't. I mean, Lego Friends. I see that here on the boxes. I just see a large amount of purple and pink on all these boxes, and they all seem to be geared towards friendship, fashion, doll houses. There's a couple of Harry Potter things, which may be the closest they come to kind of going neutral, but fair amount of Wonder Woman, Lego for girls, Wonder Woman. Here's a girl carrying a little platter with a whole bunch of cupcakes on it. Like, these are all things that have, there's nothing about science or there's some doctor stuff here, like nursing though, things like that. So when we had an advent calendar that was a Lego advent calendar that my wife bought for the two kids, and all the things coming out of there pretty much were boy related or guy related.
Well, and you have two kids, one of each, and you've had the experience on both sides. And I'm sure you've noticed during periods of this as well that there are a lot of products, not just toys, but clothing as well, that a lot of times are priced at a premium for girls. They're actually more expensive in certain cases for girls than they are for boys. And sometimes they're actually very similar items. It may be a pair of jeans for boys that's, $12, $15 at, Carter's, and the girls' ones are 18 for some random reason. And there's been a lot of stuff written about the premium that's put on children's products, toys, clothing, and otherwise, sometimes for girls, that's higher than boys. So what are we saying? Are we saying that we're going to make less of a focus on things that are for a female gendered identifying individual's preference, and by that factor we're saying there's less of a quote unquote demand and we're pricing it differently?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. It can go in a few different directions, I think, but let's move on. This episode is brought to you by Pace Painting. Pace Painting, serving all your painting needs, whether commercial or residential. Reach Pace Painting at paintwithpace@gmail.com or via their Facebook page, Pace Painting Inc. Or call Peter at 289-356-7744. Paint with Pace. Well, let's finish up with our strange news, strange facts. I think it's fair to say that the Japanese culture, occasionally brings us some unique stories, customs, traditions. And even on a couple of previous episodes, I know Paul and I talked about robot wolves that were installed in northern Japan to ward off bears from entering the town. But today, Justin, you found something you wanted to talk about. I'll just hand it over to you.
In Japan, mascots are quite a popular figure, or even figurehead for a lot of different products, different locations, or in this case, prisons. So in an attempt to soften the image of some of these correctional facilities, they have started to bring in these very bright, happy, and colorful mascots to represent some of these prisons. One specifically, as an example, is Katakuri-chan. Katakuri-chan is a prison warden with a giant purple flower for hair and is the mascot of the Ashikawa prison. I mentioned specifically Katakuri-chan because Katakuri-chan was actually featured on Last Week Tonight, the weekly show on HBO by comedian John Oliver. I can't remember exactly why they featured her, but the reason that I bring her up is because this specific prison was in trouble for its often harsh and inhumane treatment of their inmates. So the hopes were that Katakuri-chan and many of the other prisons' hopes with bringing in mascots is to kind of soften or make that visual a bit more approachable. Now, one would hope to avoid being in prison in general. And there are certain countries that are kind of well known for being a bit rough. There's certain Southeast Asian or Latin American countries that are known for having very, very tough prison systems.
Turkish prison.
Italy as well is known for being very, very rough.
Egypt, my home country.
There you go. Yes. Actually, you know what? Let me take all of that back. The only place that I could say that are known for having halfway humane or decent prisons are Norwegian and Scandinavian countries. It seems like a lot of them work on the rehabilitory factor there. They're trying to work towards skill building, and they're trying to work on the human level and getting these people to correct behaviors that led to where they are. With that caveat, Japan specifically loves mascots, loves to not talk about the actual thing, but use the mascot to talk about the thing. And using another example, just to kind of show how much of a association Japan has with it, there is a location, Miyoko City, where they have colon-chan. And colon-chan is promoting colon cancer screenings. So if you dress it up nicely and give it some nice colors and walk it through the neighborhood, the intent is to both soften and also bring attention to the location, or what, in this case, something that you want to have taken care of. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of mascots that represent everything from city wards to schools and everything in between. And if you're very interested in this type of thing, I would definitely suggest checking out mondomascots.com. Clark can put that in the notes as well. MONDO mascots.com. There is an immense fascination with mascots here, and to some effect it does help, but to others, I don't know if you're in one of these prisons, you really much care for the fact that there's trying to put lipstick on that pig.
Well, I just Googled Japanese mascots, and I came up with an article called the five of the most terrifying Japanese mascots. Japan's Yuruchara, is that what you call a mascot in Japan? Yeah.
Yes.
And yes, there's some incredibly scary and bizarre looking mascots here. There's even one with Matt Damon standing next to one that actually doesn't look that scary, but I noticed in the prison mascot, I mean, okay, so what's the point of this? Does it actually, I wonder if a prisoner looks at that and actually feels, okay, yeah, all right, life is tough. It's horrible I'm in this prison, but I now feel a sense of relief and compassion when I look at this mascot.
If I were in a Japanese prison and I saw one of those mascots, it'd probably be the other way around.
Want to tear the head off it and go crazy on it, or?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's like, oh man, this sucks.
Yes, save the money on the mascot and protect me from getting shivved in the shower, I think is probably the thought.
In Japanese prisons, I mean, that's the very much of an American perspective, is that the whole shiv in the shower. Are Japanese prisons also dangerous places for what could happen to you from other prisoners?
Japanese prisons are a black hole. Not a lot of information comes out of there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, to Justin's point, I mean, earlier, I mean, there are a lot of countries where you wouldn't want to be in prison, but Japan is definitely one of them. And, you know, we can talk forever about you know, the criminal justice system in Japan, which is pretty terrible and pretty arcane. But yeah, Japanese
to Salim's
prisons.
point, I mean, every time the UN tries to come in and do a review of human rights here in Japan, they get rebuffed. So, you know, it's not just the prisons that are black hole. Even when independent authorities are being tasked with coming in here to come in, the government's doing a great job at keeping them out as well. So there's no reality. We have no sense of how things are. And I would think most people who've been in prison are too afraid to actually share.
Yeah.
I think that would probably surprise a lot of people from outside Japan. You know, when I remember when I was reading, when I was first knew I was going to move to Tokyo, I was reading some books and websites about what it's like to be in Japan. And they did talk very much about you don't want to get in trouble by the police in Japan. And that surprised me. I mean, you don't want to get in trouble by the police anywhere, but I thought, you know, Japanese are polite, they're nice, that the prison that would extend to the police as well, that you'd be looked after in a very polite and humane way. And so hearing some of the stories about prisons in Japan and the police in general in Japan was somewhat surprising to me. And I think would surprise a lot of people that don't know much about Japan. I think if you're thinking about countries where you wouldn't want to end up in jail, you say, Sileem, you'd put Japan near the top of the list. I don't think that would be the general feeling by most people from outside of Japan.
Yeah, I mean, then again, I've never been to a Japanese prison before, so I can't really say firsthand.
Do you think it might just be you hear it's worse than it maybe really is, or?
I think there's enough information out there to
or the perception is worse than.
I mean, the perception as well, but there's still enough information out there for you know, a reasonable person to make a judgment and say it's pretty. I mean, it's pretty horrible. I mean, conditions in Japanese prisons are pretty terrible.
Well, Justin,
I mean, there might be. Yeah,
Justin, you mentioned that as a foreigner, when you if you end up in jail or in custody of the police, that there's something like they can charge you with like one crime at a time and hold you for 23 days, and then they can charge you another for the next crime and continue to hold you. Yep. And I remember,
but that's not unique to foreigners. I mean, I want to be fair. That's not. There's an extra leverage point there with foreigners, obviously, especially if you have a family, right? Because then they can separate you from your family, separate you from your job, and now you're over a barrel. And if your spouse is getting pressure from their family, you could likely end up being divorced, and there's no custody right, no visitation necessarily rights either as a foreigner here. So all of those dynamics are extra pressure points for a foreigner, but Japanese member who's being accused of a crime can be held in the same way. It can be held for 23 days for each crime. And that leverage of losing your job is a huge leverage point, enormous leverage point. And there's another element too. I mean, Carlos Ghosn, right? We'll use a famous example.
Yep.
Carlos Ghosn,
CEO.
Yep,
former.
Exactly. Got accused of in essence, misappropriation of funds, embezzlement, basically is what the general consensus was in the end. And he was held and then held, you know, they did that whole routine, you know, where they held him a couple of times on those 23-day rotations. I think it was like 2 or 3 times in where he finally actually had his chance to go to court, to enter a plea in essence, and also ask for bail. And bail is not very common here. Most people are not given the opportunity to get bail. Here, you also don't have a right to have your lawyer present when you're questioned either. So it's quite common for law enforcement to not only leverage the 23 days, but use sleep deprivation and all different forms of coercion to get you to admit to, or at least plea to something, so they can either A, get a 100% conviction, or B, save face for not having presented something that wasn't, locked down. And prosecutors here won't move forward with things unless they actually feel like they have something that's, a slam dunk.
I just can't help but think of what Sileem said about his reaction had he been in prison and saw one of these mascots. As I look at this picture of Katakuri-chan, yeah, and I'll post it in the show notes, this guy would definitely deserve a beatdown.
Yeah, where are you in the mascot ranks that you're Katakuri-chan, right? Are you well below like a Meiji milk, like mascot, or like, where's the hierarchy in mascots?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like, I think I'd prefer to be Colin-chan over Katakuri-chan.
Huh. Yeah, both have negative connotations, but at least, and they're trying to spin it into a positive. Yeah, I'd agree with you there, Colin-chan. Although having gone through a colon examination in Japan, which I pick up, I think, in episode 5, Clark's Procedure, I think we titled that episode. So if anyone wants to know what it's like to go through a colon exam, colonoscopy, just listen to that episode. And
do they have to be Patreon subscribers for that episode?
Yeah. No, that one is open. That one does not have any... I should maybe create a second one that gets a little more grisly. But I don't think that mascot sitting in the waiting room with me would have made me feel any better about getting a colonoscopy.
Hang in there, Clark.
Well, I think that's all we have time for today. Guys, thanks for joining me. Early morning for me when we do these, but I don't mind. It's always great getting together. A little bit groggy in the morning, but happy to do this, and thanks for joining me.
Likewise.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
All right, we'll have you back for sure.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Looking forward to it.
Have a good day,
Yeah.
weekend.
You too.